H for the year before being surpassed. 3 separate super typhoons reaching that kind of extreme intensity within a single season is a notable clustering, and forecasters are pointing directly at this year's El Niño pattern as a major contributing factor. According to NOAA data, the current El Niño is rapidly intensifying, with an estimated 81% chance of becoming a very strong or even a super El Niño by the October through December window. During strong El Niño years, the warmest water in the Pacific tends to shift and expand further east than usual, which gives storms that form out toward the central Pacific, closer to where Dolphin actually originated near Wake Island, more open ocean and more time over that warm water to intensify before they ever begin curving back toward Asia. Meteorologist Jeff Masters has explained this exact dynamic, noting that El Niño year typhoons forming further east get a longer runway to strengthen, which meaningfully increases the odds that any individual storm reaches Category 5 intensity before its life cycle winds down. That is precisely the setup that has now produced 3 separate super typhoons in a single Western Pacific season, and it is a pattern well worth watching as we move deeper into the peak months of the basin season. Now let's talk about where Dolphin is actually headed, because I know that is the question everybody watching this wants answered, and I want to be upfront that the honest scientific answer right now involves real uncertainty. As of the most recent advisories, Dolphin has been tracking west-northwest along the southwestern flank of a subtropical ridge of high pressure, moving at a relatively modest forward speed of around 13 to 20 kilometers per hour. That ridge has been steering the storm generally toward the Ogasawara Islands, a small, sparsely populated Japanese island chain, with forecasters expecting Dolphin to pass near Minami Torishima Island and then approach the Ogasawara chain, including the historically significant island of Iwo Jima within the coming days. At that point in the forecast, Dolphin is still expected to remain more than 600 miles south of Tokyo and mainland Japan, so this is not, as of right now, shaping up to be a direct hit on the Japanese home islands. But the story does not end there, because beyond that initial approach to the Ogasawara region, the steering pattern is forecast to shift. A second area of high pressure is expected to strengthen over the Sea of Japan and the Korean Peninsula, and that ridge is forecast to become the storm's primary steering influence in the days that follow, continuing to push Dolphin on a generally westward or west-northwest track toward the Nansei Islands, also known as the Ryukyu Islands, which includes Okinawa, before the system potentially moves into the East China Sea. I want to be very clear with y'all that meteorologists are describing this later portion of the track with real humility about the uncertainty involved. Track confidence for the next 5 days is described as fairly high, but beyond that window, forecasters are genuinely watching multiple possible outcomes. One well-known weather analyst, Ryan Maue, has described the range of scenarios over roughly a 12-day window as including a continued track toward southern Japan, followed by a curve north toward the Korean Peninsula, or alternatively, a bend further west into China, with the ensemble model guidance currently clustering on average somewhere in the waters south of the Japanese home islands. Reporting focused on U.S. military installations in the Pacific has flagged Okinawa specifically as a location that could see direct impacts by the middle to latter part of next week. Given how wide Dolphin's wind field has become, I think this kind of forecast uncertainty is actually a really valuable teaching moment, because it shows y'all exactly how tropical forecasting works in the real world. Meteorologists can have high confidence in a storm's general direction of travel for the next several days, while still holding real, legitimate uncertainty about exactly where a shifting steering pattern will ultimately carry it a week and a half out. That is not a failure of the science. That is honest communication about the genuine limits of predictability that far in advance. And I would rather give you all that honest range of outcomes than a false sense of precision. Let's talk about what is happening to Dolphin's intensity as it continues along this track, because the storm is not staying at its peak strength indefinitely, and understanding why tells you something important about how these systems evolve over their life cycle. Dolphin has already begun a gradual weakening trend, and it recently went through what meteorologists call an eye wall replacement cycle, a natural process where an intense storm's original tight inner eye wall gets replaced by a new, larger eye wall forming further out from the center. During that process, storms often see a temporary dip in peak wind speed, even while the overall storm grows physically larger and its damaging wind field expands outward, which is exactly what has been happening with Dolphin. While its maximum sustained winds have eased somewhat from the initial Category 5 peak, the radius of gale force and storm force winds around the center has actually been expanding, meaning more ocean area, and potentially more islands in its path, are going to experience significant good morning, y'all. I want to talk about something happening right now, out in the middle of the Western Pacific Ocean, because as of this recording, there's a storm out there that has officially become the strongest tropical cyclone on the entire planet in 2026, And the way it got there is honestly one of the more remarkable rapid intensification stories I have covered on this channel in a while. Its name is Super Typhoon Dolphin, and I want to walk y'all through exactly how it exploded into a Category 5 equivalent system in such a short window of time, what the latest forecast track actually shows, why scientists are watching it so closely, and what this storm tells us about the broader pattern the entire Pacific Basin is locked into this year. Let's start with the raw numbers, because they are genuinely staggering. Dolphin formed as a tropical depression out over the open waters of the western Pacific, not far from Wake Island, and from that point, it did something that even seasoned hurricane specialists described as remarkable. The storm's winds jumped by roughly 95 miles per hour in a single 24-hour period, rocketing from a modest tropical storm up to 145 miles per hour by the following afternoon, before continuing to strengthen even further. Satellite imagery captured the storm, developing what forecasters called a pinhole eye, a tiny, tightly wound eye only about 6 to 7 miles wide, forming right in the middle of that explosive growth phase. And a pinhole eye like that is one of the clearest visual signatures meteorologists look for when a storm is undergoing textbook rapid intensification. By the time Dolphin reached its peak, the Joint Typhoon Warning Center had it at maximum sustained winds around 165 to 170 miles per hour, with a minimum central pressure bottoming out at approximately 905 millibars, and gusts within the core estimated as high as 165 knots, which works out to somewhere around 190 miles per hour. Japan's own meteorological agency, using their own separate measurement standard, classified Dolphin as a violent typhoon, which is the single highest intensity category on their entire scale, reserved for only the most extreme systems the Western Pacific produces. I want to explain why a storm can intensify that fast, because rapid intensification is one of the most important, and frankly, one of the most dangerous concepts in modern tropical forecasting. For a tropical cyclone to strengthen quickly, it needs a very specific combination of ingredients all lining up at once. Very warm ocean water, not just at the surface, but extending down to real depth. Extremely low wind shear, so nothing is disrupting the storm's vertical structure, and a moist, unstable atmosphere surrounding the system that lets thunderstorm activity build without being choked off. Dolphin found every single one of those ingredients in nearly perfect alignment. Sea surface temperatures across the stretch of ocean it moved through were running around 84 to 86 degrees Fahrenheit, roughly 29 to 30 degrees Celsius, and that warmth extended well beneath the surface rather than sitting in just a thin, easily mixed layer, which meant the storm had a deep reservoir of thermal energy to draw on even as its own churning began pulling cooler water up from below, a process that would normally start choking off a weaker storm's fuel supply. Combine that deep warm water with very low wind shear, and you get exactly the kind of explosive strengthening Dolphin displayed, going from a run-of-the-mill tropical storm to one of the year's most powerful cyclones in a matter of days, rather than the week or more it often takes a system to reach that intensity. Dolphin becoming the strongest storm of 2026 is also not happening in isolation, and I think this is the piece of the story that deserves real attention, because it fits into a much bigger seasonal pattern. This is actually the third super typhoon of the summer in the Western Pacific, following Super Typhoon Sinlaku back in April and Super Typhoon Baby in early July, both of which briefly held the title of strongest storm on Urtax, even as the absolute peak intensity number comes down. Beyond the eye-wall replacement cycle, the storm is also forecast to encounter a less favorable environment as it continues along its track, with wind shear expected to increase to somewhere in the range of 15 to 20 knots, and ocean heat content values dropping, as Dolphin's own churning continues to bring cooler water up from depth in its wake. The National Weather Service's own forecast trend shows the storm's central pressure gradually rising and sustained winds gradually easing over the coming days, moving Dolphin down from a violent Category 5 equivalent system to what would still be classified as a very strong, dangerous typhoon, even after that expected weakening trend plays out. I want to touch on the historical context here too, because it helps explain why forecasters are treating this storm's eventual track with such careful attention despite the current uncertainty. Storms that originate out in the Central Pacific, the way Dolphin did near Wake Island, and then track far enough west to seriously threaten mainland Japan, are actually historically rare. By some counts, only 4 Central Pacific origin storms have ever gone on to make landfall in Japan, and notably, 2 of those 4 occurred during previous strong El Niño years, which lines up directly with the pattern we discussed earlier about El Niño extending a storm's runway over warm water further east than usual. That historical rarity is exactly why this storm has captured so much attention from the meteorological community specifically, beyond just its raw intensity numbers. Dolphin represents a genuinely uncommon genesis and track scenario that this year's El Niño pattern appears to be making more favorable than it would be in an average year. let me also talk about who is actually in the path of impacts right now and over the coming days, because even with the mainland Japan question still uncertain, there are real immediate hazards for people across this storm's path. The sparsely populated islands of the Ogasawara chain, including Iwo Jima, are expected to experience typhoon-force conditions as Dolphin passes near them in the coming days, even as the storm continues its gradual weakening trend. Beyond that, forecasters tracking impacts to U.S. military installations across the Pacific have flagged Okinawa and the broader Nansei Island chain as an area that could see typhoon-force winds buffeting the region for an extended stretch, potentially spanning several consecutive days given how wide Dolphin's wind field has grown. And regardless of the storm's exact eventual track, mariners and shipping interests across a huge swath of the Western Pacific need to be accounting for what has become an enormous system. Maximum significant wave heights within Dolphin's field have been estimated as high as 49 feet. The radius of gale force winds alone extends outward roughly 190 nautical miles from the center on the storm's northeast side, a distance that is forecast to expand even further as the eye wall replacement and weakening process continues. That is an enormous area of hazardous seas, even hundreds of miles from where the strongest winds are actually occurring at the core. Before I move to the closing thoughts, I want to spend a little more time on how this fits into the bigger picture of the 2026 season across the entire Pacific, because Dolphin is not operating in a vacuum out there. At the same time, Dolphin has been strengthening in the Western Pacific. The Eastern Pacific Basin, on the other side of the dateline, has also been unusually active for this point in the year. Major Hurricane Genevieve reached Category 4 intensity off the coast of Mexico around the same window, and Hurricane Fausto tracked north toward Hawaii before weakening. Having multiple major systems active across separate Pacific basins simultaneously is exactly the kind of signature forecasters expect to see during a strengthening El Niño year, because the broader atmospheric and oceanic conditions that favor rapid intensification are not confined to a single narrow strip of ocean. They tend to show up as a basin-wide, and in years like this one, even a multi-basin pattern of unusually warm water and low shear stretching across a huge swath of the Pacific. Meanwhile, on the complete opposite side of the world, the Atlantic hurricane season has been running remarkably quiet through the same stretch of the calendar, with forecasters noting fair weather stretching from the African coast all the way to the Caribbean and Gulf. That contrast, an explosively active Pacific paired with a notably subdued Atlantic, is itself a textbook El Niño fingerprint, since the same increase in wind shear that suppresses Atlantic hurricane development is part of what allows Pacific storms like Dolphin, forming further east than usual, to spend extra time over warm water before ever needing to fight through that same hostile shear. I also want to spend a moment on what preparedness actually looks like for anyone living across the islands potentially in Dolphin's path, because the guidance changes somewhat given how wide and long duration this storm's wind field has become. For residents and personnel across Okinawa and the broader Nansei chain, officials are already emphasizing that typhoon-force conditions, if they do arrive, are not expected to be a brief, single-day event, the way a fast-moving compact storm might produce. Given Dolphin's expanding wind field and its relatively slow forward speed along parts of its projected track, any location that does end up in the path of sustained typhoon-force winds could be dealing with those conditions for multiple consecutive days rather than passing through quickly. That has real implications for how people prepare, securing loose outdoor items, stocking enough water and non-perishable food to comfortably last several days rather than just one, and charging every device and battery-powered backup you own, since power outages tied to a slow-moving, wide wind field tend to last considerably longer than those from a fast-moving system that clears an area within hours. For anyone with maritime interests anywhere across this stretch of the Western Pacific, regardless of exactly where Dolphin's center ultimately tracks, the sheer size of the hazardous sea state this storm is generating means small craft and even larger vessels need to be giving the system very wide berth for the next several days. And if the steering pattern shifts in a way that brings a more direct threat to the Japanese home islands, the Korean Peninsula, or eastern China into clearer focus, I will have an update out for y'all immediately. In the meantime, if you have got family, friends, or military connections anywhere across Okinawa or the broader Ryukyu Island chain, this is a good moment to check in with them and make sure they are watching the latest advisories, rather than waiting until a more definitive warning is issued. If this breakdown helped you understand what is actually happening with the strongest storm on Earth right now, please subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because I am going to keep tracking Dolphin and every other significant system developing across the globe's ocean basins this season. Share this video with anybody you know who has ties to this part of the Pacific, and I will keep watching the data and bringing y'all the next update the moment there is something new to report. Stay weather aware, and I love y'all. So let me bring this together and tell y'all what I think the real takeaway from this story is, because I think it goes beyond just tracking one storm's individual path. Super Typhoon Dolphin becoming the third super typhoon of a single Western Pacific season, following an already remarkable rapid intensification event, is a direct reflection of the exceptionally favorable environment this year's El Niño pattern has created across the basin. And it tells forecasters that this kind of extreme, fast-developing system is going to remain a real possibility for as long as that pattern holds through the rest of the season. For people living across the Ogasawara Islands, Okinawa, and the broader Nansei chain, the message right now is straightforward. Stay closely tied to official forecasts from the Japan Meteorological Agency and the Joint Typhoon Warning Center over the coming days, because while the exact ultimate track remains genuinely uncertain, typhoon force conditions are a realistic possibility across a meaningful stretch of this region, regardless of exactly where Dolphin's center ultimately tracks. For everybody else watching this video, whether you are anywhere near the Western Pacific or not, I think this storm is worth understanding simply because of what it represents scientifically. A real-time demonstration of how deep ocean heat content, low wind shear, and a strengthening El Niño pattern can combine to produce the kind of explosive, headline-grabbing, rapid intensification that meteorologists increasingly consider one of the defining challenges of modern tropical forecasting.